Welcome to Lights Camera Author. I'm Jim Juno, and this is a show where we talk with authors who write books connected to Hollywood, its history, its mysteries, and its legends. On today's episode, we explore the tragic and mysterious death that helped inspire the cult TV sensation Twin Peaks. The murder of Hazel Drew in 1908 has puzzled historians and true crime enthusiasts for more than a century until now. Dr. Jerry C. Drake joins us to discuss his riveting new book that finally uncovers what really happened to Hazel Drew. Found floating in a mill pond in upstate New York on a hot July day, Hazel's murder shocked the nation and made headlines around the world. Yet less than 30 days later, the district attorney abruptly closed the case, leaving behind only rumors, ghost stories, and unanswered questions. Set during the opulent yet shadowy Gilded Age, and featuring newspaper clippings and rare photographs from Troy and Albany in 1908. Dr. Drake's investigation takes readers through forgotten streets, rural paths, and whispers of scandal in pursuit of the truth. Stay tuned as we talk with Dr. Drake about how he separated myth from fact and finally solved a century-old mystery in his new book, Hazel Was a Good Girl, Solving the Murder That Inspired Twin Peaks.
So none of us really knew that when Twin Peaks came out back in the 90s. That really only was revealed recently by Mark Frost, who was really the guy who was the intellectual powerhouse behind Twin Peaks, this kind of the script writer. Lynch was the filmmaker, and Frost is the guy who wrote a lot of the adjacent material and really was the writer on the show. And he revealed that Laura Palmer's character and perhaps some other aspects of the show were inspired by a murder that took place out here near Troy, New York, which is across the Hudson from Albany, up in the Taconic Mountains in a little town called Sand Lake. A woman named Hazel Irene Drew was found murdered in a pond, just like Laura Palmer in this backwoods kind of town. In 1908, July, after having been in the water for about a week. And as the police began to investigate, it became a national story, international story. I actually found coverage of it in Australia and in Germany. It was a 20-day investigation in which a lot of lurid press was revealed. She supposedly had a double life. This kind of scumbag reporter from New York City tried to paint her as a sex worker and a fallen woman and all this stuff, which turned out, one of the things I wanted to cover is the fact that that really wasn't true. And after 20 days, they held a coroner's inquest to determine cause of death. The district attorney here at the time, a guy named Jarvis O'Brien, who was a railroad lawyer, such a character that he actually had a twisty mustache. Jarvis looked exactly like what you think he would look like, a 1908 railroad lawyer, cartoon character type guy. I tried to get it put down as a suicide. She had three professional physicians who did her autopsy who were very clear on the fact that it couldn't have been a suicide. She was killed by a contusion to the back of her head, either caused from a blow or a fall. And someone clearly threw her into Teal's Pond. Then she had no water in her lungs, and her possessions had been rearranged on the shore of the pond. And after the inquest that determined it was a murder, the case was closed. No one ever investigated it, and it was forgotten. And there's a ghost story out in Taborton, up on Taborton Mountain, connected to Hazel Drew, that her ghost haunts the woods there. And according to Mark Frost, his grandmother told him that story. And by and large, that's what inspired him to create the character of Laura Palmer.
Now, reading your book, I was stunned by the. I'm going to be full disclosure here. When it comes to ghost stories, I'm kind of a skeptic,
Oh yeah,
you know, and you were too.
I
As I,
I still am a skeptic.
yeah,
I I'm an anthropologist by training. My bachelor's degree is in anthropology, cultural anthropology. I did a lot of work studying witchcraft and things like that long ago down in Mexico. And I have a master's in American history, and my PhD is in a field of adult education. So a lot of my work is about the lived experience. Not, I mean, there's two kinds of skeptics, right? There's debunkers who, in my opinion, are not my favorite. They've decided
mm,
that any experience that isn't absolutely rational and objective is delusional and valid. And then there are people who can live the experience in terms of anthropological context.
Right.
I say this about the book and the ghost stories in the book, and it often frustrates my publisher, who is a bit of a believer. Everything in the book happened exactly as it's described. There is no fictionalization, not one bit in that book. Now, you could sit down and ask yourself, well, maybe this guy in the white hot days of COVID, locked in his Victorian study, surrounded by all these artifacts and immersed in this thing, went a little nuts and hallucinated some of this stuff. And this was not the product of the external world, but of his internal mind. Maybe somewhere deep down in my subconscious, I knew that, Mark Frost was inspired by this story. And maybe somewhere deep down
Hmm.
in my subconscious, I made these connections when my friend moved to Troy. I'll buy that. If if that's the rational explanation, that's the emic edict, I'm fine. If that's what we want to say happened, that's what happened. But that's not what happened to me. So I told the story as it happened to me, without trying to intellectualize it. And I'm still a skeptic. Again, if I meet another ghost, maybe I'll change my mind.
Now, for those of you who are saying, "What happened to him?" We're going to find out right now because it's in the very first chapter of your book, the very first pages of your book. You went to you went looking for her grave,
Yes,
and you couldn't, and I guess
we couldn't find it, and
couldn't find it. Yeah.
that creeped me out, right? I had done some research online, and I came up here to actually try to find some of the sites. It was the first trip that I took out here. It was very, very cold. It was a cold winter, but slightly before COVID happened. I didn't have the right kind of shoes on. I had a pair of old North Face leather boots that had rotted, so my shoes had kind of fallen apart. I just threw something in the back of the SUV on my way out of DC, and I was cold. We had been up all night. I was helping my friend unpack her house. I don't think we went to bed till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were excited, you know, little bit hungover. We had been drinking beers and eating pizza while putting together furniture and that kind of stuff. So we get out to the place, very, very cold, and we spend a long time out there. And I could not find this grave. I could not find it. There's an old red oak in the center of the cemetery there across from Barberville Falls, up in, I guess it's East Post and Kill, as they say there today. And my friend put her hand on this old red oak that's in the center of the cemetery. I swear, for all, it looks like this tree was left there on purpose. Like they were cutting those trees down, to make charcoal and for hardwood, and there are very few left in the area. It's mostly pine and cedar and things that have grown in, since the area was cleared. And she had an experience. She's like, I feel like I've touched electric wire. I don't like it. This tree is weird.
Hmm.
And I did the same thing, and I was absolutely overcome. I got sick to my stomach. I started to feel ill. Um, and I was just like, and again, we can decide if this is a hallucination, imagination, whatever. But, I'm 51 years old now. And at the time, I was in my 40s and I had never seen a cardiologist. And I thought, I'm having a heart attack. Like, I have stressed myself out. I stayed up too late. I've been obsessing over this thing. And I'm miles from town and it's icy and snowy. I'm going to die out here. And I started going back to my car, stumbling back. My friend was in a fugue state. And I finally got sick. I fell down on the ground and I started to retch and I couldn't keep my feet under me. And when I looked up, opened my eyes right in front of my face, I saw the word Hazel. It was the top of her tombstone. And I began to feel immediately better. That happened. I've told that story a million times. It's exactly what happened. I even got up and took some pictures of the tree after I started to feel better, and you could see where I kind of was headed to the car and then kind of stumble
Hmm.
off to my right and go down on top of her tombstone. And that's kind of the beginning of the ghost story for me.
Right. And you even saw, you and your friend even saw what could
That
be
is the only
considered a.
time in my life I've ever experienced clairaudience. We both heard a voice, not in our heads, not imagined. I heard a voice say, "Hello, beautiful," in a
Hmm.
kind of old-timey accent, and she heard the same thing. And in my mind, I saw this vision of a guy in a bowler hat, kind of balding, in a summer suit, with a mustache. And I didn't know who he was at the time, and I later come to believe that he was the person who did the murder, not knowing anything about him. I had no suspects at the time. One thing I will say, I'm fairly certain, based on not the ghost story, but on 5 years of intensive research, that my suspect is the correct guy. And I think that if the modern police were to research this case, he would have been their prime suspect on the first day. And he should have been Jarvis O'Brien's prime suspect then, other than the political machinations I discussed in the book that I think led to this person not being correctly investigated.
Right. And this was one thing that struck me also in the book is that Jarvis O'Brien, he was more of a political, and
Yeah,
he had political ambitions, I'll say that.
yeah,
And he was more concerned with promoting himself than he was solving the case, it sounds like.
absolutely. And that's what's weird. We think of the district attorney now. We've all been colored with, all the TV shows and Matlock, and I mean, this is obviously a Hollywood tie-in podcast, but we've been watching police procedurals now since Dragnet, and we think of the modern district, prosecutor's office as professional and as lawyers who are trained in criminology and trained to prosecute and all that. In 1908, especially in New York, which was, the height of Tammany Hall and all that stuff, um, it was all political spoilsmen. You didn't have to have the O'Brien's sidekick, his deputies, they had no training in law enforcement whatsoever. They were just guys. They were just political spoilsmen. New York was starting to transition away from the Progressive Republican Party to the what would eventually become the New Deal Democrats. They were already across the river in Albany. The Democratic Party was in Albany, and Troy was a Republican town. In fact, this part of the country where I'm in right now is where Teddy Roosevelt used to come up here and go
Right.
vacation.
Yeah.
He used to go right out here to where Hazel was killed, right up the street, to hang out. His daughter spent a lot of time there. O'Brien was a railroad attorney. He was a guy who worked for the local railroad, which is still here, the industry of the time, comparable to big tech today in terms of its importance. He was not a criminologist. He was not a prosecutor. He was a guy who knew his way around indemnity clauses and insurance and that kind of stuff. And he was not qualified to solve this case. And it became clear really early on that he iced the police out of the investigation and
Mhm.
took control of the investigation. Sheriff Bacchus did absolutely nothing. The sheriff of Rensselaer County, the only thing he did was post reward signs. The chief of police for Troy, New York, lived 4 or 5 houses down from Hazel's parents, from John Drew's house. He did nothing. They turned the entire investigation over to O'Brien. O'Brien brought in one of his cronies from the railroad to say that Hazel committed suicide, and the killer had direct financial ties to Jarvis O'Brien. So he was very much a part of the old New York political machine, and it was just as dirty as you can imagine. It's
As
everything you can
today. Yeah. I
imagine.
know. I mean, it's amazing that somebody is that compromised. But then again, though, I always tell people when you're doing historical research, you've got to put yourself in the era.
Yeah,
And I mean, back in those days, back in 1908, there was no radio, there was no TV, there was no
no.
internet. Um, and plus, forensic science was non-existent back
In
in
its
those days.
infancy. In its infancy. Yeah, it was maybe only 20 years old. I think Professor Bell had been up and running over in, I mean, the guy that Sherlock Holmes is based on. He only
Hmm.
started doing his work in the 1870s, 80s. The FBI isn't really running yet. The DC had a metropolitan police. The boroughs had just been unified. Roosevelt himself had started the first like professional police department in New York. The Sûreté had been around for a little while under VDOC, and the London police was just starting to really become a scientific unit. So forensic science relied on doctors who almost did it a hobby. And coroners in those days were not always doctors. They were elected officials who held inquests, and it was people like you and me who decided the cause of death. The district attorney presented evidence, and you had a jury of just guys, people. It was all men. It wasn't women then. Sit down and listen to the evidence and decide the cause of death. There was no science about it at all.
How did you find out about this case? Because let's face it, we're looking at something 117 years ago.
I found out about the case. Same way Dale Cooper did, which I didn't realize at the time, through a series of dreams, which is very strange. And again, the caveat for the skeptics in the audience, myself included, maybe I knew this, maybe I already knew it, and I connected this place in my mind with Troy. And when this happened, my subconscious was talking to me when my friend moved here. But my friend had a dream that she ran into a person in her house who handed her a book called The Absence of Memory. And it was a teal colored book. And I thought that dream was interesting. I don't like to, there's nothing more boring than listening to people talk about their dreams, but I thought it was interesting. And I got sick, not with COVID. COVID hadn't happened yet. I had the
Hmm.
flu. Um, and I had a dream where my friend and I met up in a bar that was kind of a bar bookstore. And she handed me the book. And I looked at the cover. I can still see it clear as day. It said The Absence of Memory. And I opened it up. There was a book plate in the book that said Ex Libris, which means from the library of Hazel I Drew. And you never see words in dreams. So
Right.
I thought that was interesting. I texted my friend and I went back to sleep. And when I got up, I Googled this person's name and I got two things. I got a podcast and I got, or a YouTube channel that's a podcast, and I got the Find a Grave for Hazel Drew. And right there in the Find a Grave, it was like, this is, according to Mark Frost, the story that inspired Twin Peaks. And I'm like, well, this is fascinating. And I started to Google it and I was homesick and I got nothing to do. And I started looking at it. And my friend was having her house inspection that day. And I called her up and she's like, well, this is interesting. Now, as a hobby, I actually research mysterious cases. I'm getting to a point in my life where I'm trying to write about them, Hazel being the first, but I've been doing this stuff off and on for about 20, 30 years, since I was a teenager. And some of the things I want to actually sit down and write about now are some of the things that I've discovered over the years that are maybe a chapter in a longer book, that kind of thing. So she's like, well, why don't we mess around with this? Why don't we look at it? We weren't talking about doing a book. We just thought it'd be cool when I came up here to help her move in, drive around and look at some of the sites. So that's how we got started. Exactly that. She had a dream.
Hmm.
I had a dream. We wrote it down, Googled it, and 5 years later, here we sit with the book.
You consider yourself a skeptic, but here you are telling me about a dream that you and your friend had, and then you had a vision at the cemetery. Your friend had an experience touching the
Sure.
tree. You had the experience touching the tree. So are you still a skeptic or are you?
I think of it this way. I had the dream. I mean,
Yes.
I wrote it down that day. That story is not made up. It happened. So I'm not skeptical of what happened. But is it paranormal? I don't know.
Who
Again,
knows?
maybe I knew this. Maybe somewhere I reading online at some point, I watched Twin Peaks: The Return. I heard this story. That's entirely possible.
Yeah.
And from a skeptical point of view, that could have been what happened. Maybe that's probably what happened. But I remember when I was a little kid, my ancestors come from Appalachia, backwoods, and you know, I remember going to those kind of crazy churches where we had the Pentecost
Mm-hmm.
come into us and get into our bodies, and we would start,
Mm-hmm.
humping and jiving and doing all that stuff. And I mean, I did it. I did it because everybody else did it. I don't know why. It felt like the right thing to do. And 40 years later, I can intellectualize that, but I still did it.
Yeah.
So so I think skepticism is not a firm, you know, I can believe that there is a natural order to the world and that
Mm-hmm.
all of these things are human intellectual experiences. And so when I sat down to write the book, the original draft of the book had none of this stuff in it. I didn't include it. And after talking to my friend and my publisher and my wife, they're all like, this book doesn't work without the story, right? Like you can't, if you don't tell the stories that happened, you're lying. You're trying to avoid the supernatural aspect because you're trying to not sound crazy. And my wife's like, you might be crazy. So so just tell the story as it happened and get it over with, and if people think you're crazy, you'll just have to live with it because this is what happened. And that's it. You shove your tongue firmly into your cheek, you sit down at the computer and you start
Mm-hmm.
typing. But if I'd left out all the ghost story stuff, um, it wouldn't have been what happened. And I broke a lot of true crime rules writing this book. I put myself in the story. I actually tried to dismiss and name and rank suspects. The suspects are in the order of what I think is least to most probable. I think there's a very strong suspect who I call the killer at the end,
Hmm.
for many reasons. But this story is, you know, befitting the Twin Peaks genre because it is weird. And I want to say this, it was weird in 1908. It's not just me. Jarvis O'Brien himself had to deal with this dream logic stuff. He
Yeah.
was getting letters from people in Troy that he didn't want to talk about. And finally, the press gaggle that was always following him around said, Jarvis, you got to tell us what these letters are. These could be clues. They were letters from people in Troy who were writing to Jarvis O'Brien and said they were dreaming about Hazel Drew, and based on their dreams, they could solve the crime. So this was happening then. I don't know if Mark Frost knew that. I've never been able to get in touch with him to find out, but I'd love to
Yeah.
know. And then secondarily, Hazel's mom called in a psychic. There was all this, there was a psychic in Brooklyn who was going to solve the case. Like this was the height of the spiritualist era. This is before Houdini really starts
Yeah.
to debunk, I think. And you still had all the spiritualist movement, all that stuff. And the spiritualist movement actually started with the Fox sisters 150, maybe
Yeah.
200 miles from me, just out towards Rochester. So this was part of the story way back in 1908 as well. So we just kept the vibe going right down to the present day.
I gotta ask now, you write early in your book, and I'll let people know about this, is that it happened in July
July.
1908, beginning of July.
Mhm.
But by the end of July, it had already disappeared from the
It was over.
newspapers, which I find really wild. I mean, what pushed it off the front pages?
That is a huge question. Um, the crime of the century. I mean, I guess it was the first crime of the century since it was 1907 when it happened. Was the murder of Billy Brown.
Hmm.
She was a young woman who was killed by a guy named Chester Gillette, not the shaving family, but another industrial family here in New York with the same last name. He was kind of a wastrel kid who had been working in his uncle's concern, and he fell in love with this younger lady, or she fell in love with him, and he took her out on Big Moose Lake, not too far from Troy, and he murdered her. And rode back to shore and tried to get away. He was immediately arrested, and it was a very, very lurid trial. He was goofy. He played up himself like he was a celebrity. And right before Hazel's body was found, not very much earlier than that, Gillette was executed in Thomas Edison's electric chair. New York's got the electric chair because of Edison. It's new technology. And this case had been the dominant story aside from the politics of the day in the papers across the country uh, for a year, for more than a year. And Hazel happens right as the sun is setting on Billy Brown's story. Um, so New York City sends, just like today, if stuff happens in New York because it's where the or LA, where it's where the news media is, then it makes the national headlines really, really fast. So they sent a guy who called himself the Sherlock Holmes of America. Um, Will Clemens, up from New York. He worked for the Pulitzer papers. It was the World, the Thrice Weekly World, all the World papers, and he inserted himself into this case to solve it. He billed himself as a criminologist.
Mm.
He was not. He also said he was the nephew of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, who was Mark Twain.
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain was not related to this guy. In fact, Mark Twain hated him. He called him a worm. And Clemens tried to solve cases down in New York City, and I think at one point he gets his butt kicked for trying to do this. Like literally, one of the suspects beats him up, and he is the yellowest of yellow journalists at the time. And he takes this case and turns Hazel Drew into Laura Palmer, and it's him that's feeding the national headlines for that month. Well, he turns around and names a suspect. You'll read about this in the book who sues him. The dude is connected. He's a Pullman car guy, and you got to remember the spoils system was so deep in New York in those days. Even getting a good job on the railroad required political connections.
Oh yeah.
So this guy had political connections. He brings in this white shoe lawyer who turns around and slaps the world and Clemens with a lawsuit. and Clemens loses. So he's taken out early and kind of has to turn tail and get out of here. So without Clemens fueling the case, after the 20 days, it falls out of the headlines. But then O'Brien takes it out of the headlines. He literally says right after the inquest, "I'm handing this over to the private detectives. There's nothing the officials can do anymore. The private detectives need to do it, and when they solve it, they can collect the reward." End of the news. Um, there was a presidential election. Hazel shows up on sides with all William Jennings Bryan is in the paper, and we're talking about the transition. I mean, America was not in the best shape at this time. You know, we were breaking out of isolationism and becoming a world power. The original draft of the book, which was some 140,000 words, talked about all this stuff, and the publisher was like, "Dude, that's too boring. You got to get that stuff out of here." So America was in deep transition in 1908. I'll give you a great example. When Hazel is killed, maybe there's 100 automobiles in Troy.
Mhm.
Automobiles were rich people products. An automobile plays a very serious role in this case. Later in the year, just a couple months later, Henry Ford introduces the Model T, $800 car. You can have any color you want so long as it's black, and it changes America forever. All the trains, the railroad empires are begin to break down. By 1921, all the trolleys that were in Troy are being scrapped and pulled out. The car completely creates the American middle class and completely changes this country. The first major highway runs right through here. It's built just a few years later under Franklin Roosevelt's administration. So America is on the cusp of becoming a world power, and it happens literally right as Hazel is being killed. So a lot of things happen to knock her out of the headlines. Pick anything from 1908, and it kills the story. But without Clemens feeding it into the maw of the Pulitzer Press, there's no energy behind it.
Wow. Well, the author's name is Dr. Jerry C. Drake, and the book, and you can pick it up on AmazonBN.com, uh, or going to your bookstore
Indie
or going to
pubs,
your
yeah.
EPUBs. Yeah, you can. The book is called Hazel Was a Good Girl: The Solving the Murder That Inspired Twin Peaks, and it's out in paperback, also in Kindle.
Hmm.
And Jerry, I really want to thank you. It really was an enlightening book
Great.
from reading it. So I want to thank you again for being on Lights Camera Author.
Oh, it was my pleasure. You asked some of the best questions I've had. This was awesome.